name? Peter's just mentioned that, like me, her life took her to China, where she actually encountered Buddhism, studied it, but never practiced it. And then through other circumstances, she ended up in Papua New Guinea. And she even visited the Trobriand Islands, where she encountered a funeral exchange ceremony and felt that sort of dislocation of not understanding what was going on, but everybody else did. And then coming back to Australia and that whole thing we're all facing now, with, as Europeans, understanding the cultural foundations of this country and not the British colonial experience at all, but a 65,000 years of continuous Indigenous culture. So how do you pull the threads together is her question. And I guess where I find myself, Peter, now is that's the central preoccupation that I have, because I realise that, you know, even though that the cultural foundations of Australia are Indigenous, they're only demographically 4% of the population, and 76% of the population are of Anglo-European heritage, who often are deeply attached to the superiority of their Western civilizational roots. And so although they'd like to sort of be fair to Aboriginal people and see them do better, so the social justice element of it appeals to them because that's a strong Western civilizational idea, social justice. Very few of them understand that at the root problem for many Aboriginal people, particularly those who live in remote Australia, is that their cultural knowledge system is profoundly different to our own, profoundly. And so I've been exploring that. How do we, non-Indigenous people, find a way of connecting to that different way of thinking? And to put it as simply as possible, I'd say it's to find a way of living in a world that is thoroughly animated, where all of nature, including the earth itself, is imbued with spiritual presence, has its own voice, and speaks to us if we learn how to listen to it. And that's the way Aboriginal people experience it. It's called a relationist ethos, versus the kind of, whereas our culture, we have a strong separation between humans and the rest of the natural world, called anthropocentrism or human exceptionalism, because we're very smart, you know, we've got intelligence, we've got language, we've got culture, and the rest of nature is considered to be mute. And that's led us down a path of either exploitation of nature for our benefit, all the way through to factory farming of animals, raping the seas, benefits with factory fishing, all the way through to then the opposite side of that, which is strong concern for stewardship, which is nature conservation. And so we look about protecting wilderness areas. Whereas if you talk to Aboriginal people, they said there is no such thing as wilderness, because for them, the natural world and the human world's completely it's interconnected. There's no wilderness versus human habitation. All of the Australian continent was, from their point of view, inhabited. It was all connected with songlines and stories and ancestral beings. So that's where the difference lies. So how do we bring these threads together? And I kind of tried to do it in this book, Peter. Since 2018, although I'm a sociologist of technological innovation for my sins, I was once a technological optimist before its dark side became ever more apparent. But so I then thought, well, how do I bring all this together? So I was running this thing called the Blue Mountains Creative Arts Network, which I'm still president of, but I set up a thing called the Regenesis blog. And that comes out of all that regenerative agriculture, regenerative architecture, regenerative thinking movement. So I stole the term regenesis actually from George Monbiot. He wrote a book about soil. And I thought, well, if you could give Australians just a simple story. So I came up with 3 principles that you could build a whole new story about. One is caring for country, and that would build a bridge between eco-spirituality of Indigenous systems and stewardship ideas and sustainability. Multiculturalism, but acknowledging that also meant incorporating different knowledge systems as well as different faith traditions, as well as different gender. So that taking multiculturalism and expanding it that way. And then the third pillar was a move to a well-being circular economy. So a non-waste economy where you re-engineered the industrial production system, and the well-being wasn't just of human beings, but the whole of the natural world. So I thought that's a simple way, 3 pillars, and you could build a new story. Unfortunately, the political class haven't taken up this idea, but that's the way I tried to build the 3 things together. Anyone else? Yes?
Part of my journey through my life so far, I'm just initiate the one
Is so I didn't hear the last bit. So what was the last word? I didn't hear it. Yeah. Yeah, got that. Okay. So you were given a skin and all of that. Yep. Yeah.
So this separation.
Yep.
That completely appeared from.
Yep.
So I don't see separation between anything anymore. Everything, for me, everything is connected. You know,
yep.
You know, everything.
Yeah.
To break free of have, we need
Yeah.
Go through what people.
Yeah. Yeah.
The only way.
Yeah.
Find
Thank you. What's your name?
Peter.
Peter, another. So Peter's just talked about that his own journey involved him being initiated into the Bundjalung people, and so he took on through, they gave him their stories and their understanding, and through that he's developed that loss of separation with the natural world and that destructuring, if you like, or the unlearning of the Western way. And that's through one form or another, we all have to go on that journey. For him, it was by being initiated into the Bundjalung people. And for those of you who don't know, they're the people who live up in the Northern Rivers area of New South Wales. So that's one particular, it's a difficult path to be adopted into an Indigenous people because it brings with it a lot of responsibility and in terms of kinship relationships. I spent myself a year living and working with an Aboriginal elder from the Central Desert called Jilpi Bob Randall. He asked me to help him work on his autobiography. So I travelled with him all through his country, and we had lots of conversations about the relationship between my Buddhist understanding of life and his own understanding of Aboriginal culture. And so even though he was a man, and as you know, in that system, there's women's business and men's business. So there's some things we couldn't talk about. So I'd have to go off and read lots of books and then come back and ask questions. And one of the things that he said to me that was very interesting, I said, look, why is the punishment for breaking the secrecy provisions around ceremony? So, you know, when the young boy's taken on a songline journey, they learn a particular part of the song cycle. But if they gossip about that to anyone that wasn't on that journey, they suffer severe punishment traditionally, which either getting speared in the leg or even killed if it was serious breach. So I said, well, what's the purpose of such a punishment for that breaking secrecy? And he said, well, this kind of knowledge is not something you gossip about. You've got to hold it deep inside, and it's meant to transform your very being. And I went, because that's exactly the reason for why you have secrecy provisions, in Tibetan Buddhism when you receive certain ceremonial knowledge and you do those practices. I mean, many people have asked me, well, you know, what impact did doing a 3-year retreat have you? And it's kind of hard to put any language to. It's similar. It's like it goes deep inside you and it becomes part of you. I can't actually language it without destroying it. So I decided at the end of the 3-year retreat when I came back, I mean, apart from having to get a job and refund myself for old age, I thought what I'm going to try to do now is just live the truth of this, which is, I guess, what you're doing, Peter.
Much.
Yeah. So how do you bring that into your life? Yeah.
I also have conversations with people with their
Yeah.
have a lot of work
Yeah.
over the years,
Yeah.
and I don't like the way
Okay. They've been an outlier. So Peter's just explaining, I'll just explain to the audience giving the recording, that he hasn't really ever felt at ease with the way Western culture is. So he's had to do a lot of unlearning himself, a lot of destructuring. And that's, you know, his kind of, I mean, there is a deep unease across modern culture at the moment, which you've experienced early on, but now many people are feeling. And we have a rising mental health problem of anxiety and depression. I mean, it's permeating everything. And it's not just the cost of living crisis. So that's part of it. People feel really in their bones that things are falling apart. And part of the reaction of the sort of Trumpism, the populism, the right-wing nationalism is an attempt to try and claw back what was once regarded as the inevitable destiny of the white man, because people feel it's slipping away. And people generally don't know what to do. So I think we are going, that's one of the books that's deeply influenced me is by a woman called Vanessa de Oliveira called Hospicing Modernity. And she says basically modernity is falling apart. But what we need to learn to do, taking from the stages of grief, is we learn to hospice the process. You know, and if you, I don't know, you're familiar with the 5 stages of grief. I think it's anger, denial, bargaining, depression, acceptance. So you can kind of see that playing out politically, really, can't you? Bargaining is where you try to fix up the system, which is kind of what progressives try to do. And anger is where the populist right-wing nationalists are. And depression's where the people who are freaking out and thinking, what's the point? How are we going to survive? What's going to be there for my grandchildren? And then acceptance is people who are sort of saying, well, it is falling apart. And how do we live with it? How do we live with the trouble? Have any of you heard of Bayo Akomolafe? Well, he's a very interesting Nigerian philosopher. He's all about how you got to stay with the trouble to allow the imperceptible to blossom in the cracks and crevices of the crumbling system. And my metaphor for this is buildings full of concrete cancer or being white-handed, you know, that are falling apart. But in the cracks and crevices, these little flowers are appearing, you know, and that's what he says. You've got to nurture these new little shoots that are occurring as people start finding different ways of being. Maybe you've found yourself, Peter, as you've tried to live the Bundalang way yourself. And many people around the world are doing this. There's little movements all over the place, actually, which you can hear about, where people are sort of experimenting in small, small ways. It's never anything you hear in the dominant commentariat, because it's not part of that world. That's about anger and bargaining. But any other comments or questions?
Points in between
yeah. The difference I would say is that it's that Tibetan Buddhism through deity yoga involves working with what I call the mythopoetic. So where you, in Aboriginal culture, those what we call deities in Tibetanism, they call ancestral beings. They're mythopoetic expression of a particular form of creative energy, which are past, present, and ever present and future. Like they're beyond linear time. And they're kept alive in the stories of the songlines. And they're transmitted through the process of ceremony. So, and then in ceremony, people sing up the ancestors to be present. And through totem, they also have totemic relationships with the natural world. So that's their way of expressing it mythopoetically. And, you know, and particular stories are owned. They're not accessible to everybody. You've got to be initiated into it. You have to have the right to tell the story. So there's big problems of cultural appropriation if you as a non-Indigenous person simply start using their stories as your story. In Tibetan Buddhism, we call it invocation. So there's a 7-line prayer, where you sing up the presence of Guru Rinpoche, who's the sort of archetypal principle of enlightenment in the Nyingma tradition. You sing it up through this invocation prayer, and it actually becomes a living presence in your being. And if you spend 4 months in a retreat doing it, believe me, it becomes a very vibrant part of your being. And your vision, and then one of the things you do in the Tibetan Buddhist system is, as well as using mantra, which is like a subtle vibrational energy that you get going in your system. It's in Sanskrit, so it's sort of like considered sacred sound. And it's activating what in Tibetan Buddhism is called the subtle energy body. So they identify a subtle energy body, not just the physical body. Right? And I think Aboriginal culture have a similar kind of idea, but they don't call it that. And that's esoteric knowledge that you'd need to be initiated to have access to. But in Tibetan Buddhism makes their knowledge more available, but there is also the same controls of secrecy about what you talk about publicly and what you don't. So you make it become part of your being as a way of experiencing reality. And one of the uses of the visualization, so you create these visualized mandalas, is to break down your assumption that the taken for granted world you see around you is all there is. So you spend 4 months living in an alternate reality in a way. And then you begin to sort of see how permeable reality is. So, I mean, there's one of the books that I found that gave me most insight to this in Aboriginal culture is a book called Song Spirals, published by Allen and Unwin, and it's written by a group of women from East Arnhem Land with 3 Western women geographers who lived there for 10 years working with the women on this. And it was originally written in their language before it was translated. But they said song lines is too linear. It's a song spiral. And it's a process of co-becoming. And there are many layers of realization of what that co-becoming is as you go through ceremonial transfer. And I think that's true in the Tibetan Buddhist spiritual journey too. People who are long-term practitioners have probably experienced this. There are layers by which it begins to transform the way you experience reality. I mean, meditation's not just about being calm and peaceful. You know, it's much more profound than that if you get into that level, you know. So there's sort of realization that the nature of reality is open potentiality. And that's the optimism of everything fixed. And you can learn then to dance with life from that space. Yeah. Any other? Pardon?
I wanted to hear more about the Dakini.
Okay. So my experience.
How you said that your 3-year retreat that you realized that you have always heard before.
Yeah. I mean,
what was that about?
I realized then that my whole life had been this process of disruption. You know, I grew up in rural Queensland. I had a racist, angry, what we would now call, what do we call it? Where men seek to control, what's it called? Coercive. My father was a master of coercive control. So he was an angry, insecure man. And I grew up, and we didn't have any books in my family. It was very anti-intellectual. I always felt how did I land here? You know, I felt completely like I don't belong here. And even my mother would say to me, Barbara, where did you come from? So then I got out of it by I got a job in Brisbane as a typist initially when I was 15. And then I met a person on a tram who told me you could get an education by going to night school to get a matriculation. So I did. And then then I found out that there was a public library I could go to. So then I dreamt of being a student. I used to dress up as one even when I was going to work as a typist. And eventually then I got enough money to stop working for a year, and I went to night school every night of the week and I matriculated. So that was the first disruption, you know, because I thought to myself in that typing pool, this cannot be my destiny, like this. And then I ran into a woman in a tram who told me a way out. And then I became a teacher out of that experience. But I'd studied university subjects part-time at the same time because I really wanted to go there. And the first subject I chose was the cultural history of India and Pakistan, you know, because I was always drawn to other worlds. So that, again, it's the Dakini calling to me. But I think the next then I fell into becoming a member of the Sydney Push when I came to Sydney, because someone I'd met on the China trip told me to meet them at the Newcastle pub, and I then ran into someone I knew, and, you know, that's where I ended up in Sydney as this sort of bumbling Brisbane girl. And then I met on a demonstration walk down George Street when the Gurindji people walked off their land. That's when I met Charles Lepani, who became my husband, that's my son sitting back there, that's who his father is. And I wanted to go to France. I mean, I was in love with Jean-Paul Sartre and existentialism. I had no actual interest in going to live in the third world. But I met this man, fell in love with him, we got married, and next thing I found myself going off to live in Papua New Guinea. So that was the next disruption. You know, so I just continual disruptions. It was this idea of the Dakini as the disruptor. And then the more I looked into the Dakini, there's another great book called Dakini Warm Breath by Judith Zimmer Brown. And she talked about the multi-layered nature of the Dakini, the inner, outer, or outer, inner, and secret. So I, you know, kept looking, kept feeling this inside myself. So all of these ways. And then I think in this book, I mentioned it right at the beginning, I composed a poem to the Dakini when I was sitting up on a hill at Lerabling to express this. Where did I? Let's see if I can find it. Here it is. Pandro Yeshi Sogyul, fearless lady of lotus light, hear my plight, fill my heart with your blessing, opening it into the vast expanse. And then, and I mean, the poem went on at different levels about as a sort of spiritual experience, and realizing this call of this thing had reverberated all my life, you know. So it became real to me. I mean, one of the things I've always felt with a lot of Western students of Tibetan Buddhism, they don't make it real enough. It's still out there a bit. They don't swallow it, you know. They don't feel free to write their own poetry, to make it their own somehow. Yeah. Does that answer anything? Yeah. And I'm very keen for women to realize it's not gendered. You know, it actually is available to men as much as women.
When you said that, I was thinking, you know, we have, you know, the Guru Padma Barbara, all the male days, and they're available for female. So why shouldn't the female days be available?
Yeah, and the whole, well, you people familiar with the Yub Yum idea? And a lot of Tibetan deities visualization is a male and female in sexual union. It's not about sex, right? It's a visualized expression of the indivisible union of the masculine and feminine. So, and because you know, an embodied culture that's not scared of sex is expressed that way visually. Like in the West, we go, ooh, but in that culture, no problem, even though it had all these monks. Because it wasn't treated like sex, it was treated as a visualization of an idea. And sometimes some practices have where the female takes the dominant position, not the male, you know. And one interesting book that survived is an autobiography by a Tibetan female Turton, Kundro, Sarah Kundro. Have you read that book? It was, again, it was translated as part of an American scholar's PhD, but it's very interesting because it's a female Turton writing about her whole spiritual journey. Yeah. Turtons are these sort of special class of people who, this is where I said it all gets a bit wild and more like what I think similar to Aboriginal culture, because Turtons were a class of master who received teachings which they either found secretly buried in rock and had a vision and were able to pull these things out of solid rock, or they came to them as a vision and they reveal a whole cycle of teaching. And often the person who revealed it to them was known as the Dakini. That's like the Longinyentek. And then the authenticity and strength of that practice was how much in the practicing of it had brought spiritual realization. So like it just defies Western ideas of what's possible, even though people have witnessed it, even Westerners have witnessed this happening. So it's got, that's what I mean, it's got this quality that takes it outside of Western sort of scientific ideas of materiality into something other. And so one element, it's a mystical journey. And I think, you know, in Aboriginal culture, they've kept that mysticism alive through their ceremonial knowledge. And what's extraordinary about it is that it has survived 200 years of brutal colonial suppression, not just physical massacres and taking people off their land, but what's called epistemic violence, the deliberate destruction of their knowledge system, of their language, of their cultural practices in the name of civilization. But it survived. The resilience of Aboriginal people, despite all of the stories we hear about violence and domestic violence and alcoholism and drugs, they've somehow kept alive that knowledge system. And it's now, there's a renaissance happening in Australia of this knowledge, a bit like Tibetan Buddhism renaissance. And it's coming through schools of Indigenous studies at university. These scholars, what they call the post-colonial scholars, who are writing this stuff and making films and theatre, and I mean, it's just extraordinary. This is 4% of the population, and yet the outpouring and how it's challenging different structures is quite extraordinary. It's the one big contribution I think universities are making. And I think it will produce, slowly but surely, an intellectual revolution in Australia. You're just an early person on the journey. I think it will, you know. Pardon? Yeah. So even the Bundjalung people who are heavily impacted by colonialism. I mean, one of my closest friends is an anthropologist called Inga Reevey, who was a very close friend of John Roberts. So the Roberts family, of course, were very big in the Bundjalung people, still are. So, you know, I'm a bit familiar with that's why I know where the Bundjalung are. And because she's done a lot of work on native title and stuff, she's told me, look, Barbara, it's still alive, it's still strong. And one of the things we were talking about earlier, I mean, the interesting thing that's happening even within Christianity is Indigenous theologians are now challenging the Western interpretation of Christianity, and they're developing their own theology. They've now even got a school of Indigenous theology at the University of Divinity. And that's really revolutionary because, of course, Christianity was the handmaiden of colonial suppression. And yet they're turning it on its head. So I get very encouraged by all of that. This is an underground revolution that's bubbling up. Of course, white fellas will fight it. They won't go. We won't give up our privilege easily. But
I thought it was interesting when you said earlier, sorry, making a comment. So it was interesting when you said earlier about holding on to what I saw was, what I've been thinking lately is when there was Biden and Trump in the US, I kept thinking that the Americans are holding on to their grandfather. So it was like they wanted to think of the past, and
yeah,
put the past into power, so that they could hold some sort of culture together. Well, now they've got young, dynamic women, young girls like that.
so Amanda, for people on the link, Amanda's talking about American politics, how before it was Trump and Biden as the two old grandfathers. And now there's a contest between an old man and a younger woman. And more that she's also biracial.
Yeah,
She's
and
Indian, black,
Indian,
and
both
Jamaican.
sides.
And yeah,
His vice president is married to an Indian, and there's an Indian Jamaican on the other side.
yeah, well, she's not American Indian, she's Indian American. American Indians are like indigenous, and Indian Americans are people who've migrated from India. Yeah. Yeah. Confusing terminology.
Both sides got Indian people.
Yeah, well, that's what happens when you have a multicultural society. I'm not sure you should read. I think it's good, but I think Kamala Harris belongs in the bargaining, and Trump is clearly in the anger camp, but neither of them are yet tuned into this new story. And I don't blame them. They're trying to run a country. And America's been, the COP, the international COP that's tried to hold the international rules-based order together at vast cost to itself, really, but a big cost to other countries as well. And it's falling apart.
It is falling apart.
And, what's happening in America is just,
I think the power shifting.
yeah. So you wanted to. Yeah. It's part of there's an international movement of First Nations. So in fact, I've just ordered a book that actually compares the different worldview within Christianity, and it's written by an Indigenous American Indian theologian, right? But also I read that in Australia, the new University of Divinity has now a school of Indigenous theology, which they say is the missing link in all the First Nation stuff coming out of university. So, and I mean, I guess one of the person who's prominent that's going down this track is Stan Grant.
Really?
Who's very strongly now talking about his Christian faith, but he's coming at it from within this Indigenous theological perspective. So if you want to find out about it, look up School of University of Divinity and Indigenous theology. And I mean, I know, like Inga's told me about in the Bundjalung, when Bundjalung people have a funeral, it's a very elaborate process because they brought a whole lot of Indigenous cultural elements and attitudes to the way they treat a funeral, very different to a Western funeral. And yet it's within a Christian framework. Christian church has. Yeah. Okay, well, see, within the West, we would say there's a separation between Christianity and paganism. That Christianity was a separation from paganism, which is when we had a kind of nature worship. Now, and it's not like Indigenous people, to put Western paganism on top of Aboriginal culture is a violation. It's got nothing to do with Western paganism. It's got its own internal system, and that's why some people are trying to construct, bring Druidism to the West. I mean, there are people up in my community where there are people active in that way. But because they're trying to find a Western tradition that was nature worshipping. And it's one path you can go down, but it makes more sense if you do that in England than Australia, because the earth here is full of a different story and it's not Druid. So finding our way to that story seems to me more significant than trying to bring Druidism in or call it paganism. That belongs to Western cultural history that's European based, nothing to do with this place. That's my view anyway. I mean, people can disagree with me, but that's my view. It's part of that Western colonization process where you keep trying to bring it back into the Western system. It's what we try to do. It's how we know how to learn. So it's not strange that people do it. The other's difficult. You got to sit with not knowing, of confusion, of an open question, of feeling incompetent, you know. As Bayo Akamalafe says, you got to sit with the trouble. You've got to get out of solutionism, because that's what we're trained to do. Find the problem, find the solution. That's how Western culture works. You've got to put all that aside. You've got to embrace ambiguity and uncertainty and confusion. What's that, Louise?
Or find the solution and go.
She was saying that in the Western system, we find a solution and then look for a problem to justify it. Any other comments or questions? How are we going for time, by the way?
5 to 8.
Pardon?
5 to 8.
5 to 8. Okay. Come on, any other questions, comments?
I want to hear you talk about your book.
Oh, yeah, because the normal way is meant to talk about a book. Okay, well, this book, The Call of the Dakini, is, I think the chapter that's most interesting is the Guru Yoga chapter called The Mystical Path. So if I've got the books here, and if you want to get a copy later and I'll sign it and you can buy them, they're going to be available for sale over there. But if you look at the chapter headings, I had a big problem working out how to chronologically order it. You see, do you go from your childhood to your adulthood, or do you choose it thematically? And I mean, I'm not an experienced writer at all. I mean, I'm an experienced writer of analytical, intellectual stuff, but not this kind of stuff. You know, that was a whole new experience for me to sort of, and I try to also respect my children's privacy by not bringing them into the story. So I, let out the irrelevant personal gossipy stuff, because I think that was irrelevant to me. The story was about the Call of the Dakini. And I mean, I had various relationship issues and stuff along the way that greatly enriched my life. I mean, I'm blessed with having had cross-cultural relationships with people from other cultures, one of whom was an Indian law professor that I met in Papua New Guinea, Peter, in the dying days of, after my husband and I separated, in the last days of my time in Papua New Guinea, when it was developing its new constitution, the advisor to the independent Papua New government on its constitution was this Indian law professor from Uppsala University in Sweden. And we became friends because his wife, who's Swedish, had recently left him. So we were kind of drawn together as these two abandoned marital partners who were sort of intellectually interested. And we ended up having this sort of 10-year long distance relationship. And he was an Indian law professor from East Africa, but was married to a Swedish woman he'd met in East Africa, and they had mixed race kids. And so we used to meet in different parts of the world and have holidays together and things. And he used to come out here because he was advising Solomon Islands, Fiji, and everybody else on how to deal with their problems. So he was an important part of my story. I mean, I mentioned him, but he nourished me really at the end of my marriage, when I felt very dislocated, even though my husband and I separated on very amicable terms. But it was difficult. I thought my life was going to be in Papua New Guinea, and now I came back to Australia. Had to reinvent myself then as an Australian, find my roots here. But so in my book, the chapter that I think I just take you through the journey. So what else do you want to know then, Anthony, in terms of the book?
Why can I buy it?
Well, okay. Yeah, well, I start off with a sort of general overview of the Dakini, and then I do structure it chronologically. So I go from my childhood to the marriage, the colonial divide, and life in the third world, back to Australia. Then I do a thing about perception and reality, and a very weird experience I had in the Australian Museum. That was another disruption. I was busy being the director of the Council of Social Service of New South Wales on leave from my public service job in the Cabinet Office. And one day I took the kids to visit the Papua New Guinea, the Probrian Island collection in the Australian Museum in College Street. And as I was gazing at these objects of, canoe prows and pots and stuff, my mind took me back to travelling in an outrigger canoe across the ocean lagoon to one of the islands to the south. And, there'd been a wild storm that had swept up and we'd had to take refuge in a little village. And as I was remembering it, just waves, the most extraordinarily intense energy just came pouring out of these objects in glass cages through me. I just couldn't make sense of it. I had never had an experience like that before in my life. That when I went back to work and I was sitting around the table, looking for solutions to complex welfare problems, I just couldn't pay attention. It's like a door opened in my mind. And I just knew I had to walk through that door. And I called it my journey into the epistemological abyss. So that was a really big disruption, because then I chucked in my job, actually, went to live on the South Coast at Stanwell Park. And it was then then things fell apart again. And that's when I met Soga Rinpoche as my Buddhist teacher and began that journey. I mean, like most Westerners, I turned up because I was full of emotional pain and suffering and trying to look for a solution. That's I heard about this Tibetan Lama giving a talk at the university, so off I went. But something, I don't know, something as he spoke, because he was funny and earthy, he wasn't, ethereal. And as he spoke, something just opened in my heart. So I rocked up to his afternoon talk and said, "Can I be your student?" And he said, "Well, you better come to my retreat." And I said, "What's a retreat?" And he said, "Well, where is it?" He said, "Bellingen." And I said, "Where's Bellingen?" He said, "You're the Australian." So I rushed home and looked it up and got myself a flight. And then on the plane, I found myself sitting next to him. Luckily, his attendant was a woman doing her PhD in anthropology. So I had someone who could intellectually interpret this strange new world I was stumbling into. But that's how I began, see, in that sort of clumsy way. But that event that happened in the museum had already got me interested in ways of knowing. So it wasn't just about healing my broken heart. And then I was doing, that's right, for your answer on the Dakini, I was at the same time, I was doing a master's degree in science and technology studies on the sociology of innovation. And I was doing all this feminist literature about the masculinity of science. So then I decided what I needed to do was make fertility sculptures for my garden celebrating the feminine. So it was all sort of this huge, and I was reading all Joseph Campbell's work on mythopoetic stuff. So it was all a sort of cauldron of exploration, really, that came out of those experiences. So I talk about that a bit. And then I go into the, the sort of the Buddhist journey. And I think the most important thing was to understand, because one of the things that's often misinterpreted in Western stuff is Guru Yoga. Because a lot of Westerners do, they sort of turn Guru Yoga into a form of celebrity culture, really, hanging off the word of the teacher and celebrating them as these celebrity figures. But for me, it is a mystical part, not about their personality or whether you want them as your boyfriend or your husband or all that fantasy that students can get into. It's that they're a portal somehow or other, in some curious way that I have no understanding of. They have the power, if they're a really good teacher, to provide a pathway for you to get out of your own way. I don't know, Amanda, did you find that? Yeah, because Amanda's also had Soga Rinpoche as her teacher. And I don't know any of you know here, but he ended up in his later years in scandal, you know, because he was accused of bullying his students and sexually misusing them. So that was a big turning point for people, you know, because that was like, well, was he guilty of all that or wasn't he? And what did it mean for us as his students? So I don't go into that because that sort of happened, but was a bit raw and not worth going into anyway. It just buys into that whole story. Pardon?
And they'll be disrupted.
Yeah, and it sorted the chaff out from the straw, because a lot of students went into the whole Western story of what that was about, of how teachers are meant to behave.
But I
But-
think it also a lot of people saying, you know, like their own history.
Yeah,
So I think the people that have reacted most strongly would have had a history of.
yeah. So Amanda here is talking about the fact that some people reacted to the Soga Rinpoche accusations because of their own history of distrust or misuse in their own relationships with people, and then they projected that back onto Soga Rinpoche. I mean, I work really closely with him, you see, so I'd seen a lot of all of this play up close. And I mean, I've experienced Rinpoche whacking me over the head with an umbrella, you know, to wake me up. And I knew where that was coming from. It wasn't coming from bullying. It was actually coming from waking me up, because it's part of the traditional story. You know, it's in the Sensei tradition, if you like, of the East, where when you take on a spiritual teacher, you really take them on, you give them permission to be strict with you, and a bit like what, you know, and that's true in Aboriginal culture as well, you know. So they can be very gentle and kind, but they can also be very forceful if they're trying to sort of help you wake up. So I kind of understood that framework, and I wasn't sucked into all of that story. But you're right, some people got triggered by it. Pardon? Yeah, and they also they project them onto a pedestal, and then when they don't behave like the projection, then they get upset. Yeah, because in the end, they're human beings. I mean, they get sick, they get tired, they get irritable, just like ordinary human beings do. They're in a human body, you know. They're not gods. And does that,
You want to ask,
pardon?
you want to ask another question?
Yeah.
So what, how do you read it? What did you expect the reader to get out of it? What were you saying to me?
I think the two things I wanted the reader to get out of the book, and I guess the book's written for the 76% of the population who share my cultural heritage in particular, people who are other students of Tibetan Buddhism, who are confused and don't really understand what Tibetan is about as a result of all of this. It was my dedication to my teacher. This was my story. And coming at it from I'm not a sort of goofy celebrity worshipper, but someone with a strong intellectual background, actually. That this was my understanding of it. What I wanted to get out of it was this question: what's the link between us and the Indigenous knowledge tradition? Because the first introduction sort of talks about that. And then the Guru Yoga question, I wanted them to understand that it's a mystical thing. It's not hero worship. And I think in the end, the last chapter I wrote was towards regenerative living. So it ends up with this whole idea that Peter and I were talking about. Where do we go from here? How do we make this a living experience? Because one of my concerns about the way a lot of Westerners approach Buddhism is that it's the sort of dessert on an ordinary Western life. It doesn't sink in. It doesn't change anything. You know, it's just something you do on the weekend, a bit like Christianity is for most people. It doesn't really do what Peter was talking about, disrupt you. It doesn't destructure your set of assumptions about the world. So I kind of wanted them to understand that we need to unlearn. I mean, Soga Rinpoche used to talk about that. The spiritual path is about unlearning. It's about, instead of getting, it's about giving up. It's about letting go. You know, so I wanted to share that, I guess.
So,
Yeah. Well, I think Peter's just asking what's the viable alternative for how do we continue to live in a capitalist society when we know all of this. I think it's the big problematic of our time. And on the one hand, you know, we still have to pay the rent and in all that sort of stuff and live. But then if we know that it's all falling apart, we have to pay attention to that. But at the same time, we have to nurture ourselves. So how do you, instead of falling into despair and anger and anxiety, how do we nourish our inner spirit? You see, that's where I think finally that comes from. Because if you can, your inner spirit is strong. You know, this is in Buddhism, they call it your Buddha nature. It's an inherent part of you that you can give birth to within through practice, through spiritual practice. You actually can't get it from reading books. Sorry, Anthony. Pardon?
How does that sit alongside?
Selflessness means that there is no such thing as a fixed self. It's not selflessness. The no self means that there's no fixed entity called the self. Like Barbara is a process, right? A continual process of interaction with the world around her, of which there is agency, but it's nothing fixed and definite about it that I have to protect and defend and promote. It's the opposite of selfie culture, right? It's experiencing yourself as a sort of dance, a process that's constantly, and that's that freedom that comes with being learning how to dance with life, you know, deal with life's curveballs. So if you're not trying to hang on to things as the source of your identity, sure, I mean, if you can't pay your rent, you lose your house, that's difficult, very difficult. You can't take away that difficulty. So you've still got to pay attention to basics. And if shit happens, you have to learn how to deal with the shit, you know, because it does happen. Many people have experienced homelessness, which they never thought they would. You know, we are in the middle of a crisis on that front. This is real. But we can learn the difference between happiness and contentment, of learning to be content with a lot less. Get off the consumerist bandwagon is step number one, you know, and get your nourishment from non-consumerist based sources.
You know what I'm curious about? When you talk about self-respect and spirit,
So Louise is just asking, where does selfie culture come from? This endless need to photograph yourself with a filter to achieve a certain look and then promote it to the world on social media by TikTok or Facebook or whatever. And as we know now, it's an intrinsic part of tourism, is to prove you've been there. So it's rather than experiencing the place, you simply post yourself there as the experience. I mean, it's essentially narcissism. And according to Vanessa de Oliveira, modernism is a narcissistic culture. So it's the end product of the essential narcissism that comes from the individualism and the transactional nature of a capitalist world. Pardon? Yeah, well, she says there is. So it's the end product. And of course, all it's done is that social media has amplified it. And as we know, that's the nature of algorithmic capitalism, the clickbait. You know, everything you click on amplifies. So that's why the misogyny increases, narcissism increases, because it's what's getting the clickbait. And that's part of the unraveling of modernity. See, it's the dark side has got its own rhythm, and it's coming back to bite it. I don't know whether you ever saw that idea of blowback. That, well, you know, for America's adventurism in controlling the world, the blowback is all of those with ISIS. You know, the blowback now is what's happening to Israel. I mean, Israel's becoming a pariah state, you know. I mean, look, did you hear the news today? Today, the society of Israel is so fractured that when the Israeli Defense Force tried to send in its investigators to investigate the rape of a Palestinian prisoner and which ended that person up in hospital with horrific injuries, they were set upon by the settlers of the group that had caused the problem. So the Israeli Defense Forces and that civil war, if you like, where one part of the army tried to defeat the other part of the army, and now you've got the right-wing part of the Knesset, the Israeli cabinet, defending that action. So they've got their own Trump constitutional challenge happening right now in Israel over this issue. I mean, Israel falling apart just as America is, even more severely. And of course, the Palestinian people are the long-term sufferers. Yes. Yeah, so the comment there is that the problems of the world seem to be intensifying. Well, Anthony, it's partly he's a journalist, that's why I'm turning to him.
Not anymore.
Oh, not anymore. He's a recovering journalist, the why I'm a recovering technology optimist. That's how the media works. I mean, what we experience is what the media tells us, which is intensifying it because that's what sells. That's, the search for the attention economy, the search for attracting attention. So they ramp up the conflict because that's attention goes to that. I mean, if you looked at the history of the world, there's been lots of trouble in the world forever, really. I mean, look at World War I, World War II, So it's just that it's more exposed now because we've got this instant media 24-hour coverage that we can't turn away from it the way we once could. Doesn't.
I do think there's, I mean, I think the greatest problem that we face is inequality.
Yes.
And the tension that comes from that. And I don't know it well enough, but I suspect that we're at a point where the disparity is well, I certainly know it's the greatest risk.
Yeah, well, Louise here in the audience has just raised, sorry, I've got to do this for the audience. She just raised the importance of understanding the impact of growing wealth inequality. I would say to you that historically, basically we're dealing with that arc of development where middle-class prosperity was the promise, which, if you like, went from the end of World War II in my lifetime, really. And we've come to expect that the working class and the middle class would have continuing growth and prosperity and material well-being through health services. I mean, look at the housing. It goes from a humble house to one where every bedroom's got its own bathroom, the whole expansion of consumerist variability where coffee is not one but 10 varieties of coffee beans, this endless exuberance of consumerism fed by advertising. But that really is fairly recent. If you go back to World War I, the period of the 1930s, there was immense inequality. It's just that the working, it took unionism to drag the working class out of the gutter. But then the contest was between the nobility and the working class. And then after World War I, Europe got flattened from the war and then had to rebuild itself. And then the same thing happened after World War II. But I mean, a lot of people like America made its money out of World War II. That's how it became wealthy, supplying the weapons to the Germans and then to the West. It was the great, so, it only got dragged into the war after Pearl Harbor. Before that, America first was the philosophy. So that wealth inequality we're now seeing, which I agree with you is a huge underlying cause of a lot of unrest, is a feature of this recent history where we were promised it would not be so. And without that middle class strength, democracy can't survive.
The unraveling.
It is. Capitalism's hoisted on its own petard, particularly the neoliberal market-driven version. Yeah. And of course, you know, when you look at what's Project 25, is that it? The American right-wing solution? What's it called?
Project.
Pardon?
Project 25, the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah, the Heritage Foundation is all about how to absolutely amplify that ad nauseum, you know. So they still see their wealth, they want to hang on to their wealth and grow it. And I have no idea what beats that. I mean, how many houses and cars and whatever other baubles do you buy? None of it's logical. You know, now it's all fantasies of conquering space, you know, goes endlessly on. So where does that come from? What's the underlying driver of the psychological driver of it is what we have to understand, because it's completely nonsensical.
But don't think that it's true.
Pardon?
That it's true.
Yeah, the cause of suffering. You're right. Yeah, Buddhism goes back to, that's right, Buddha understood it right from the beginning, you know, suffering and its causes. And so it's interesting if you go back to these essential principles that are in Buddhism. I mean, I'm sure other spiritual traditions have it as well. There is a fatal flaw in human beings, you know, the greed, aggression, and indifference, you know, that Buddhism talked about is the fatal flaw in the human psyche. But what we've done in Western culture, which we've now exported to the world. I mean, it's no longer exclusively to the West. I mean, China and India are full of it as well. Saudi Arabia, it's all the same story. Is that greed's amplified, aggression is amplified instead of controlled, you know.
This doesn't just come from being disconnected.
Part of it, yeah. I mean, well, that's what a lot of the First Nation scholars say, that if you live in a relational world where you understand that you're part of nature and you're governed by the inextricable laws of interconnectivity, then you learn harmony, you learn restraint, because otherwise you die out. Because they lived close to only what was, you killed only what was necessary. You didn't kill for pleasure or for trophies on the wall. You know, you killed for what was necessary and you honoured what you killed. That's a very different psychology, isn't it? Yeah.
Totally upside down.
And you were bound by your relationship with others. You never saw yourself as an individual who could do whatever you like because it was your individual right. You were bound by all sorts of social constraints. I mean, you know, even the Trobriand Island culture, that's what all of that funeral thing. I learnt there, one of the things I talk about in that book, because I was present when one of my in-laws he kicked his wife during an argument after work over betel nut, which is the sort of addictive nut that you chew. And she got sick and collapsed and went to hospital and she eventually died. So, you know, we would take food. So there were the mourners and the relatives. So under that system, the relatives of the man who was what we would say guilty had to do the crying to prove that they were not intent on causing the death. I think, and anyway, and the other group fed them, sort of like an exchange. And we were camped outside an Indigenous, one of the cousins who was a doctor at the hospital. And suddenly this woman started speaking in their language, which I couldn't understand. So I asked my husband, what is she saying? He said, she's saying, she's speaking in the dead woman's voice and she's saying, do not charge my husband Dagi. It was not his kick that killed me. It was the betel nut was poison. And I said, oh, what a load of rubbish. Of course his kick killed. Ask your doctor cousin. Of course it was the kick. But then I realised that explanation is useless. Because what needs to happen after a death is how do you repair the fabric of society? So they then, you know, so then all that exchange ceremony of gift exchanges is all about re-knitting the net of relationships that hold the culture together. You know, that's why the funeral takes that form. And even in Port Moresby where we lived, I mean, my husband, every weekend he'd be off to a funeral exchange ceremony, even in the city. And a large part of his income had to be spent on buying pigs and food and stuff for this process, because that's how the society knits together. Cause and effect, not the way we, with revenge, all that doesn't exist. Because otherwise the culture would fall apart. Because they're bound within a bioregional sustainability system, you see. They lived on an island, a little group of islands. But we expansionists in the West, you see, we go out and conquer other worlds. And when we run out of Earth, we're going to go to the moon or Mars or wherever we've got in mind. Or go into robotics, or we'll transform ourselves into cyber.
And then just go.
Or we're going to virtual reality, yeah. Anybody else before we wind up? Yeah. So we have to go back to that's where Buddhism's teaching on the Four Noble Truths does provide an answer for that. Right? Because it's all about that suffering in the human psyche is pervasive. It takes many forms, and it pride and these, what they call the dukkha, or the sort of pleasures, the negative emotions come to play. So unless you have a culture that manages that series of, there's a lot of historical analysis of how this comes about through technology and control, and the development of agrarian culture leads to hierarchies. Many people have tried to answer that very question you posed. And about why do some cultures, when they get into power and separation, it leads, and then the civilization collapses, and then other cultures. It's wrong to romanticize Aboriginal culture as perfect at all. That would, there were about 600 language groups, I think, here in maybe 250 language groups with variation in Australia at the time of colonial invasion. And they had different rules and how they work with one another across language groups. But they had a very low level of material technology, highly sophisticated social technology for how they manage those relationships. Probably the most complex kinship system anthropology's ever documented. And that was their social technology. But their material technology for domination and even for conflict was quite weak, And so wherever you get, the development of material technology, the war, the conflict escalates. So even in Papua New Guinea, which is quite warrior culture really in the highlands, but the technology for conflict was quite low, they didn't have metal. And in fact, in many of their little tribal conflicts traditionally, when one person got killed, the whole conflict stopped while they went through a big mourning ceremony, and then they resumed again. So it's this constant sort of struggle, but it never escalated into a big war. because the material technology for that didn't exist. Now in modern Papua New Guinea, it does. They've got guns and steel. So now the tribal conflicts are quite difficult. It's not that they were sort of essentially peaceful. It's just their means for escalating the conflict didn't exist. And therefore they needed to have strong social technologies for managing conflict so things could go on. I mean, Trobriand Islands was a little bit different because it was often a little island on its own, wasn't very warrior-like really. They had very strong technologies for managing conflict there. But different cultures come up with different solutions. Now we have to see what we do. I mean, Buddha back in 500 years before the birth of Christ, he developed a whole technology for how you can tame the worst excesses of the human psyche, really. And that's, you know, if you follow that path, you can learn that. But it's not what you call a mass religious movement, is it? Because it requires a lot of self, you know, examination, and it's not, you know, it doesn't fit in with the dominant culture. So it's a specialist little group of people who follow it, really, in the West anyway. And in other cultures where it's dominant, it's often what I would call cultural Buddhism, a bit like Christianity's cultural Christianity. It's not that it's actually a strong spiritual practice amongst people. I mean, in China, you go off and put your joss sticks in and get the Buddha is going to give you wealth. You know, a lot of it degenerates into that. So, you know, we shouldn't glamorize all of that. We have to kind of get real. I think. What's the time? We there? Right. We can thank you everybody for coming. I hope you got something out of it. And
on behalf of the trust, we just want to thank you all for tonight for the sound that you give goes to the speakers to help them continue with their work and to the library.
no, please, any dana for me, give it to the library. So yeah. So as I said, there's two things can happen now. If you'd like me to sign a book and buy a book, you're very welcome. And then there's tea and coffee and refreshments through the door. So thank you all for coming very much. Okay. It's been a great pleasure having you here and the opportunity to talk about all of this. Thank you. That kind of work.